Hello, welcome to Phantom Homicide, the Axeman of New Orleans. New Orleans, the Crescent City. Such an amazing place, it just breathes history and mystery and this incredible musical energy. But if we rewind back to 1918, 1919, that energy, it was just drowned out by this wave of pure agonizing terror. We're doing a deep dive today into the legend of the Axeman of New Orleans, an American serial killer, completely unidentified. His brutal campaign, it just shattered a community in a really short time. We're talking barely 18 months here. But researchers, they think the death toll could be anywhere from 6 to 17 people killed, and maybe another 6 to 14 injured. And now, over a century later, it's not just unsolved. It feels more like a ghost story, still haunting the city's folklore.
Absolutely. And to really get a handle on the Axeman, you first have to understand the place itself. New Orleans back then, 1918, it was a city with deep, deep societal cracks. World War I was just winding down, which meant all this economic and social upheaval. And crucially, the victims, they were almost all from one specific group, the city's large Italian immigrant and Italian-American population.
Yeah, and that wasn't just random chance, was it? There was already this kind of undercurrent of prejudice against them.
Exactly. This community, they often ran small grocery stores, the corner bodega, visible businesses, and they were already viewed with suspicion by a lot of the established Anglo and Creole communities. You have to remember the history there. There's this dark backdrop of anti-Italian feeling in New Orleans, which, well, it tragically blew up in 1891 with the lynching of 11 Italian immigrants. Just horrific.
Well.
So that suspicion, it was almost institutionalized. When the Axeman started hitting these families, the authorities, honestly, they were quicker to think, oh, it's internal stuff, mafia feuds, black hand extortion rackets, rather than considering an outside serial predator. And that bias, it fundamentally crippled the investigation right from the start.
And then there's the city itself, the way it was built. The architecture almost felt like an invitation for someone like him, didn't it? Tell us about how vulnerable those homes were.
Oh, completely. The city's unique layout and climate created, well, a perfect storm, really, a perfect hunting ground. You've got the famous shotgun houses in New Orleans.
Right, long and narrow.
Exactly. Long, narrow places, often packed close together. Security was minimal, lots of doors, light construction. Then you add in the New Orleans heat. That intense, oppressive Gulf Coast humidity, people basically had no choice. They had to leave windows open, often doors too, or just poorly secured, simply to get some air to ventilate.
So easy access.
It was a massive structural vulnerability, and the Axeman, he exploited it again and again with this chilling consistency. He didn't need to be a master of stealth, The climate basically opened the door for him.
Okay, so our mission today, it feels pretty ambitious. We need to look beyond just the body count, beyond the scary headlines. We're going to try and dissect his method, that weirdly precise way he got in, analyze the contradictions in his profile, like how could he be so organized in planning, but so frenzied in the act? And maybe most importantly, we really need to unpack the single most bizarre piece of this whole puzzle, that letter, the one that basically forced an entire city to play jazz music all night just to stay alive. We want to understand why this isn't just a cold case file anymore, why it's become this defining piece of New Orleans mythology. Let's start with his signature, the Axeman's MO, because it really was this strange mix, wasn't it? So methodical getting in, but then utter chaos inside.
The methodology is fascinating, yeah. First, the weapon. He almost always used an axe or a straight razor, but the calculation involved is key here. These weapons, they were nearly always found at the scene. They belonged to the victims or were just lying around nearby.
So he wasn't carrying his own weapon in.
Exactly. And that's classic planning. By using the victim's own stuff, he avoids carrying an incriminating weapon to the scene, and maybe even more crucially, he avoids carrying a blood-soaked weapon away from it. It cuts down the risk of getting caught dramatically.
That suggests someone who's really thinking ahead, isn't it? Planning their escape, protecting themselves, which seems almost at odds with the break-in itself. It wasn't fast, it sounds like. It took time, patience.
It does. The consistency in how he got in points to planning, maybe even some skill. The Axeman would chisel out a panel, sometimes a whole wooden section right out of the back door. Now, that takes time. It requires quiet patience. It's not like just kicking a door down.
And he left tools behind.
Often, yes. The panel itself and the chisel he used were frequently found just left there near the door on the floor. It's strange. It almost suggests something ritualistic. Or maybe it was kind of signature, a way to show how easily he could control the situation.
So, okay, organized entry. But we know robbery wasn't the motive. You said money, valuables, they were consistently left untouched. That really forces us to dig into the why, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If it wasn't for profit, What was driving him?
Yeah, when you try to piece together the motive, you're left with these conflicting theories, and all of them point towards some kind of severe psychological compulsion, not, financial gain. The most obvious theory right away, given who the victims were, was ethnic targeting. Since almost everyone was Italian, the media just jumped on it. Mafia, Black Hand, that was the narrative.
Easier for people to accept, maybe, given the prejudice you mentioned?
Exactly, it fit the existing bias. But the facts didn't really line up, there were no demands for money, and the sheer brutality, killing infants, the elderly, that doesn't fit the usual pattern for organized crime hits or extortion. It completely undermined that explanation. So criminologically speaking, the pattern hints at a different kind of drive. Profilers looking back at it, they often lean towards sexual sadism.
Really?
It's a theory. The idea is maybe the killer was specifically after female victims. Maybe the violence itself, the violation, was the source of satisfaction, and he only killed the men if they got in the way, if they were an obstacle. That could potentially explain the frenzied nature of the violence, how deeply personal it felt.
It's that level of violence that seems so defining. The repeated blows to the head, the deep slashes. It speaks of rage, doesn't it? Not just efficiency.
It's pure overkill, yes. The attacks were just marked by extreme brutality, these repeated, devastating strikes, usually to the head and face. It suggests either uncontrollable rage, maybe panic once he was inside, or just a profound psychological disturbance. And that's why the profile is so tricky. He had the control, the patience, to do this precise, quiet entry that's an organized trait. But then, boom, he seemed to just decompensate into this wild, frenzied, almost disorganized attack once it started.
Now, we can't really ignore the strangest motive theory, can we? The
Yeah.
idea that he was doing all this to promote jazz music.
Right, that truly bizarre idea, which of course comes entirely from the letter we're going to talk about later. It's probably less a real criminological theory and more, a weird side effect of a possible publicity stunt. But it became such a huge part of the story, you almost have to mention it when you're talking about the psychological chaos surrounding the whole case. Regardless of the real motive, though, the brutality is the core identifier. The targets were vulnerable, often asleep, and the attacks were just devastating.
Let's walk through the timeline. Because these attacks, they didn't just spread fear, they caused this massive systemic chaos in the investigation. It all starts with the Maggio family, May 23rd, 1918.
This was the horrific start. Joseph Maggio, an Italian grocer, and his wife Catherine, attacked in their apartment, asleep in bed. The killer used a straight razor, found right there, to cut their throats. Catherine's head was almost severed. Then they were both struck with an axe. Joseph died soon after his brothers found them.
And the first clues immediately pointed the police in the wrong direction, didn't they? Towards the family itself.
Absolutely. The investigation got skewed right away. They found bloody clothes at the scene, presumably the killer's, suggesting he changed before leaving. But the blood-stained straight razor, it was found on the lawn next door, belonging to Andrew Maggio, Joseph's brother, who happened to be a barber. So naturally, Andrew became the prime suspect. His story was that he was so drunk he only heard some groaning noises through the wall. He didn't report hearing the actual break-in. Now, he was eventually released, but focusing on him early on, fueled by this assumption it was an internal family dispute. It just wasted critical time and resources.
And there was that cryptic message left at the Maggio scene, too, that really hinted at something maybe deeper, maybe a longer history the police weren't seeing.
Yes, that message is crucial. Scrawled on the pavement outside, Mrs. Maggio will sit up tonight just like Mrs. Tony. Researchers strongly suspect this refers back to a 1912 attack. Another pair of Italian grocers, Anthony and Joanna Sciambra. Joanna was killed in that attack. So this message implies one of two things. Either the Axeman had actually been active for years, maybe responsible for that 1912 murder, or he was just deeply obsessed with similar past crimes and was deliberately weaving them into his own twisted narrative.
Chilling. And then just a month later, the attack on Louis B. Sumer and Harriet Lowe. That just seemed to pour gasoline on the fire, turning the whole thing into a media circus.
Oh, definitely. Louis Basumer, he was a Polish grocer, actually. And Harriet Lowe was his mistress. They were attacked with Basumer's own hatchet, found critically injured. Basumer had a skull fracture. Lowe suffered permanent facial paralysis. In this case, it just had all the ingredients for the sensationalist newspapers of the time. The affair, the backdrop of the war, and then the absolute mess the investigation became.
It generated so much misinformation, right?
It was a policing nightmare. First, in their rush, the authorities arrested Louis Ubicon, an African-American man who worked for Basumer, purely on suspicion, zero evidence. He was eventually let go. Then Harriet Lowe, she was disoriented, obviously suffering terribly from her injuries, and she started making these wild, conflicting statements. At one point, she accused Basumer of being a German spy. Yeah, because the police found some letters written in German in his apartment. This was wartime, remember? So Basumer gets arrested temporarily as a spy. But the real tragedy, investigation-wise, came later. Months later, Harriet Lowe died from complications from her injuries. But just before she died, on her deathbed, she named Basumer as the one who attacked her.
No way.
Yes. So Basumer gets arrested again, this time for murder. He spends 9 months in prison. And then in May 1919, he goes to trial. And the jury acquits him in 10 minutes. 10 minutes.
Wow.
The lack of evidence, the unreliability of Lowe's dying declaration, it was just too flimsy. But it really shows how desperate the city was. They wanted someone to blame. Anyone.
Then in August 1918, we get the case of Anna Schneider. And this one kind of raises questions, doesn't it? Was it even the same person?
Right, Anna Schneider. 28 years old, 8 months pregnant, viciously attacked, bashed in the face, scalp cut open. She survived miraculously, and even more miraculously, gave birth to a healthy baby girl just 2 days later.
Incredible. But the details were different here.
2 key anomalies. First, no forced entry. Police suspected she was attacked with a lamp, maybe one taken from a table right there in the room. Second, her husband reported that $6 or $7 were stolen from his wallet.
Ah, so there was theft in this case.
Exactly. That's the one rare instance where theft is clearly reported. So it raises the possibility, was this maybe an unrelated assault, an opportunistic attack? Or could it have been a very early copycat crime?
But just 5 days after that, the attack on Joseph Romano snapped everything back into focus. The Axeman's MO seemed to be back, and this one really, really terrified the city.
Joseph Romano, an elderly man, found by his nieces, Pauline and Mary Bruno. Severe head trauma, he died 2 days later. His home was ransacked, but again, nothing valuable taken. Reinforces that non-robbery motive. And crucially, the nieces gave a description of who they saw fleeing. A dark-skinned, heavy-set man wearing a dark suit and a slouched hat. And the bloody axe was found nearby. Classic Axeman pattern.
This murder seemed like a tipping point, didn't it? The public was demanding answers. And that led to the first real public attempt at, psychological profiling.
The fear was absolutely palpable. You had people boarding up their houses, families moving in together for safety, everyone buying guns. It was chaos. And this spurred John D'Antonio, a retired Italian detective, to go public with this theory that got a lot of attention, even though it was pretty amateur by today's standards.
What was his theory?
He basically suggested the killer was a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde type. Someone with a split personality, killing without any apparent motive, driven by some internal compulsion. D'Antonio stressed that this person could likely lead a totally normal life most of the time, then suddenly be overcome by this urge to kill. It was the city's first real attempt to try and make sense of something that felt completely irrational.
Then the next big event, the attack on the Cordemelia family in March 1919. This one is just sickening. It shows that the justice system itself completely failed under the pressure.
Yeah, this tragedy happened in Gretna, just across the river from New Orleans proper. Charles and Rosie Cordemelia, they both survived terrible skull fractures. But their baby daughter, Mary, she was killed right there in her mother's arms. And the entry method. Classic Axeman. Panel chiseled out of the back door, axe found outside.
But the investigation went horribly wrong here, leading to innocent people being jailed.
It's just a gut-wrenching story. Rosie Cordemelia, under immense stress, grieving, she later admitted it was out of jealousy and spite. She falsely accused her neighbors. Orlando Giordano and his son Frank. Orlando was this frail 69-year-old grocer who'd actually rushed over to help them, and the physical evidence didn't even make sense. Frank, the son, was 18, a big guy, supposedly too large to have even fit through the small panel chiseled in the door.
But they were convicted anyway.
Despite Charles Cordemelia, the husband, strongly defending the Giordanos, saying they were innocent, the police were just desperate for a conviction. They ran with Rosie's story. The Giordanos were convicted. Frank was sentenced to hang. Orlando got life in prison. It took almost a year before Rosie, overwhelmed with guilt, finally recanted her entire testimony in public.
Unbelievable.
They were eventually released, but it just shows the Axeman's terror didn't just kill people physically, it destroyed lives through wrongful imprisonment too. It demonstrates a real collapse of civic order under that kind of fear.
Okay, so after the Cordemelia case, but before the final attacks, we have the infamous letter. And then the Axeman seems to come back, but maybe the pattern shifts a little.
Yes, that final burst of activity. It either shows him maybe relaxing his own rules slightly, or possibly includes some definite copycat attacks mixed in. August 10th, 1919, a grocer named Steve Boca gets hit in the head. He survives. The classic chiseled panel entry was there. But then, in September, you get Sarah Lohman. Now, she was a young woman, not Italian, living alone. And significantly, the entry wasn't a chiseled panel, it was an open window. That's a deviation. She survived, too, but had no memory of the attack.
And the terror finally comes to an end, supposedly, with Mike Pepitone in October 1919.
Right. Mike Pepitone was attacked, struck in the head. His wife woke up and actually saw a large figure holding an axe fleeing the room. The crime scene was reported as exceptionally gruesome. Blood everywhere, apparently even splattered on a painting of the Virgin Mary, a detail that feels almost deliberately sacrilegious.
Did his wife get a good look at the attacker?
Unfortunately, no. Mrs. Pepitone, who had 6 children, could only give the most basic description. The killer was large. And that attack, October 27th, 1919, is the last one officially attributed to the New Orleans Axeman.
The violence itself is terrifying. But what really catapulted this whole story into, cinematic mythology was that single piece of communication he sent out. Let's talk about the letter from hell.
Oh, this is truly something else. Unprecedented, really, in American crime history at that point. March 13th, 1919, this letter shows up, supposedly from the killer himself, and it gets published in the local papers. It was theatrical, very literate sounding, and just completely chilling. A direct message, basically taunting the entire city.
What did it actually say? What were the main points?
Well, the author immediately tries to set up this supernatural persona, claiming to be beyond human justice. I mean, the language is so dramatic, you can almost hear it being declaimed. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman.
Wow.
It was just this vicious taunt, promising more death, saying he'd leave no clue except my bloody axe besmeared with blood and brains, and he openly mocked the police, calling them utterly stupid, saying it amused his satanic majesty, Francis Joseph, etc. Just bizarre stuff.
But the proposition, that's the part that's just wild. He didn't just threaten. He offered a way out, right?
Yes. The proposition of infinite mercy, as he called it. He announced he would pass over New Orleans at exactly 12:15 a.m. the following Tuesday night, March 19th. And that night just happened to be St. Joseph's Night, a huge celebration, especially for the Italian community he'd been terrorizing.
Okay.
And here was the promise. He swore, by all the devils down below, that he would spare every single person in whose home a jazz band was playing in full swing at that exact moment, 12:15 a.m.
That is insane. A killer demanding the entire city throw a giant, defiant jazz party to save themselves.
It's like psychological warfare mixed with some kind of perverse appreciation for art or maybe chaos. And it immediately makes you question, is this letter even real? Skeptics point to how sophisticated it sounds. It doesn't really sound like the rantings of a disorganized, rage-filled killer. It shows literary flair, maybe some education, definitely confidence.
Did it have any inside info?
No, that's the thing. It didn't contain any details that only the real killer would know, which makes it highly possible it was a hoax. Maybe a newspaper editor trying to sell papers, or maybe even someone involved in the early jazz scene looking for a bit of notoriety.
But the police and the public, they took it seriously at the time, didn't they? That gives it some credibility.
It does. The authorities, the newspapers, they had to treat it as genuine. They couldn't risk not taking it seriously. And, modern profiling does suggest that some serial killers absolutely crave notoriety. They get power from taunting people, from dictating terms. So whether it was real or a hoax, the effect was immediate, and culturally, it was massive.
Describe that night, March 19th, 1919. The city must have just been roaring with sound.
It was extraordinary, a cultural event basically born out of pure mortal terror. The whole city just erupted. Every dance hall was packed solid. The demand for musicians just skyrocketed overnight. You had professional bands, amateur bands, playing jazz in hundreds of homes, clubs, all across the city. People who couldn't afford a band just cranked up their record players full blast.
Wow. The community didn't respond with panic. Not really. They responded with noise, with defiance through music. They literally did exactly what the demon letter told them to do.
And the key thing is, no murders happened that night.
None whatsoever. The Axeman, if it was him, kept his word. Or if it was a hoaxer, they were satisfied with the chaos they'd created. And that night cemented the Axeman's place in history. It even inspired a jazz tune called The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz, Don't Scare Me, Papa, permanently linking this terrifying figure to the actual musical soul of New Orleans.
Okay, let's pivot back to the investigation itself, because the path is just littered with failures, isn't it? Hasty arrests, convictions based on grudges, and just the basic limits of forensics back then. The failure was absolutely systemic. We talked about the early false arrests, Andrew Maggio, Louis Bassumer. And the most egregious, of course, was the wrongful conviction of the Giordano's, based purely on Rosie Cortemilia's spiteful false testimony. These cases really show that the police were under such intense pressure from a terrified public, they started prioritizing just getting a conviction, getting closure, over actually finding the right person through careful investigation.
But looking back, historical research has sort of zeroed in on one main suspect, hasn't it? Frank Mumfree. Why does his name keep coming up, even if the evidence is mostly circumstantial?
Yeah, the historian Richard Warner really pointed the finger at Frank Doc Mumfree. He also used aliases like Leon Joseph Monfree or Manfree. What makes Mumfree a compelling figure is his connection to the very thing the killer, or the letter writer, seemed obsessed with: jazz. Mumfree ran a small jazz business himself down in the Garden District, and supposedly his business started doing unusually well right after the Axeman's letter created this sudden, citywide demand for jazz bands and records. It creates a convenient, if maybe too neat, motive for him orchestrating the whole jazz night spectacle.
And then there's that story, that legend almost, about how Mumfree met his end, which, if true, neatly ties up the whole mystery of why the attack stopped.
Right, the legendary ending. It's a widely circulated story, but you have to take it with a grain of salt because the documentation is pretty thin. A lot of historians consider it apocryphal. But the story goes that Frank Mumfree was shot and killed out in Los Angeles in December 1919. That's just 2 months after the last known attack, the one on Mike Pepitone.
And the shooter.
Supposedly, it was Pepitone's widow, getting her own personal revenge. Now, if that story is actually true, it gives you this clean, satisfying ending. It identifies the killer and explains perfectly why the violence just suddenly stopped, but it's a big if.
Okay, if we try to look at the Axeman through a modern criminology lens, that mixed profile we talked about earlier really stands out. It makes profiling him incredibly difficult, doesn't it? Let's unpack what that mix really means.
Yeah, when profilers talk about a mixed profile, they mean the killer shows traits from both the organized and the disorganized ends of the spectrum. The Axeman clearly had organized traits. The methodical way he got in, the planning involved in escaping, choosing weapons already at the scene, his geographical awareness, he knew the area. These all point to planning and control.
But the minute he was inside, that control just seemed to vanish.
Exactly. Then the disorganized traits just explode onto the crime scene. The extreme frenzied violence, the overkill we mentioned, using whatever weapon was handy, which points towards spontaneity, even if the disposal was planned, and leaving the scene messy, like leaving bloody clothes behind, no attempt to stage it or clean up. This internal conflict, this mix, it suggests a few possibilities. Maybe cognitive dissonance, perhaps someone struggling with a pathology that was escalating, or maybe the careful planning actually allowed the killer to feel secure enough to just completely let go, abandon all control once the violence began.
And for law enforcement at the time, that must have been devastating.
Oh, absolutely. Because he didn't fit neatly into the organized killer box or this disorganized killer box, that makes predicting his next move or even knowing what type of person to look for extremely difficult.
And the targeting itself.
Yeah.
It feels mission-oriented, focusing on Italian grocers. But if you don't know what the mission is, it's impossible to really profile the purpose.
Precisely. That strong focus suggests a specific goal, maybe even a delusional one. Was it ethnic hatred? Was it revenge for something specific related to a grocer or that community? Was it just a delusion that fixated on this visible group? And because they lacked modern forensics back then, no DNA, fingerprinting was rudimentary, record keeping was often terrible, they could never definitively link the psychological why with the physical who. They couldn't connect the motive to a person or even be sure all the crimes were connected.
And we have to come back to that shift in victims near the end. That attack on Sarah Lallman, non-Italian, attack through an open window, not a chiseled panel, that really throws a wrench in the works of the single killer theory, doesn't it?
It does. It forces us to be cautious. That deviation suggests a few things. Maybe the Axeman finished whatever his original mission was and just started expanding his targets. Or, perhaps more likely, the Lallman attack was a copycat. Think about it. The level of terror in New Orleans was so high, it would have been psychologically easy and maybe convenient for the police and media to just attribute any brutal, unexplained assault with a blunt object to the now legendary Axeman. It could easily blur the lines between the real killer's work and other violent crimes.
The mystery just gets deeper when you consider how abruptly it all stopped after the Pepitone murder in October 1919. Just silence. No more attacks, no more letters, nothing.
Yeah. That sudden stop is often the biggest riddle in an unsolved serial case. We basically have to rely on the standard theories here. The most likely, and the one that fits nicely with the Mumfree legend, is simply that the perpetrator died. Either natural causes, an accident, or maybe through violence, like the revenge story suggests. Other strong possibilities. Maybe the killer got locked up for some other unrelated crime that would take him off the streets. Or maybe he just moved away from New Orleans. He could have potentially continued killing elsewhere, but those crimes were never linked back to the Axeman pattern.
And then there's the more abstract idea, the psychological one.
Right. If the violence was driven by some specific, intense psychological stress, maybe tied to a job, a relationship, something in his life, then if that stressor went away, if it resolved itself, the need to kill might have just vanished. He simply stopped, walked away, which leaves this huge, frustrating blank space in the historical record.
But what's undeniable is how much this case resonates even today. The Axeman isn't just a historical footnote, he's woven into the cultural fabric of New Orleans.
Oh, completely. He's moved way beyond true crime files now. He's in art, he's in folklore. The legend has inspired novels like Julie Smith's The Axeman's Jazz. Ray Celestin wrote a great one with the same title. A lot of people probably first encountered him on TV in American Horror Story, Coven. And he's definitely a staple of New Orleans tourism now, ghost tours, crime history walks. You hear the chilling details of that letter being recited almost nightly down there.
The fact that they never caught him basically made him immortal, didn't it?
It really did. That anonymity means the myth can just absorb everything, every theory, every fear, every weird cultural quirk of that era. And that brings us to the final provocative thought we wanted to leave you, the listener, with. Especially when you consider all the media hype and the absolute chaos of the investigation back then. Given the lack of modern forensics, the completely contradictory eyewitness accounts, remember, they ranged from German spy to just large man, and the intense pressure to just label these crimes, you have to ask yourself, was the Axeman of New Orleans really just one person? A single unified serial killer with one specific motive? Or is it possible that multiple separate violent crimes were happening in that turbulent post-war prejudiced city, and they all just got lumped together, grouped under one terrifying, convenient, and honestly highly marketable legend by an anxious public and a sensationalist press? The real truth might be a lot messier and maybe less singular than the myth we know today.
Okay, so we hope you liked our today's discussion. For more such discussion, subscribe to our channel, Phantom Homicide.